The alarm clock on the nightstand read 5:47 a.m., but Jasmine Parker had been awake for hours. She sat at the small kitchen table in her studio apartment, surrounded by papers that represented 2 years of meticulous preparation: bank statements, school records, medical documents, character references, email printouts, each one carefully organized with colored tabs, each one a piece of evidence that she was not the woman Marcus's lawyer would claim her to be. The manila envelope sat in the center of it all, thick and heavy with truth. She'd written "Court Evidence Custody Hearing" across the front in careful block letters, as if official-looking handwriting might lend her amateur legal work some legitimacy. Her hands trembled slightly as she checked the contents for the 5th time that morning. Everything was there. Everything was organized. Everything had to be perfect because she was walking into that courtroom alone, without an attorney, without the expensive armor that Marcus wore so easily. In the next room, separated only by a folding screen that pretended to create privacy where none existed, her daughter Zoe slept curled beneath a worn comforter, 8 years old and already learning to make herself small, to take up less space, to navigate the war zone between two parents who had once loved each other and now could barely speak without lawyers as intermediaries. Jasmine stood and moved to the narrow mirror hanging beside the door. The woman staring back was a stranger. She'd straightened her hair the night before, pressing the hot iron through her natural curls until they lay flat and obedient against her skull. Professional, she'd told herself, presentable. The words tasted like accommodation, like the 1,000 small ways she'd learned to smooth her edges, so white spaces wouldn't find them too sharp. The navy blue dress she'd borrowed from her sister hung loose in places where stress had stolen pounds Jasmine couldn't afford to lose. But it was conservative, modest, the kind of dress that said responsible mother instead of woman who sometimes cried in grocery store parking lots. She adjusted the collar, practiced her posture, tried to see herself through a judge's eyes, and found only exhaustion looking back. A memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp. 3 years ago, standing in her own classroom, surrounded by second graders who looked at her like she hung the moon. She'd worn her hair natural then, a glorious crown of coils that her students loved to compliment. She'd worn bright colors and laughed easily, and believed that loving her job and loving her daughter would be enough to build a life on. That version of Jasmine felt like someone she'd read about in a book, fictional and impossibly distant. Marcus had been in the doorway that day, unannounced and unwelcome, his presence a cold front moving through her warm classroom. He'd come to discuss logistics, his word for the systematic dismantling of their shared life. Even then, even as their marriage was crumbling, she'd tried to accommodate, had stepped into the hallway so the children wouldn't hear, had kept her voice low and reasonable while he'd made demands that were anything but. The coffee maker gurgled, pulling her back to the present. The cheap digital clock on the microwave showed 6:15. Court was at 9. She had time, but time felt slippery this morning, moving too fast and too slow simultaneously. She poured coffee into a chipped mug and returned to her papers, reviewing her notes one more time. She'd prepared a statement, practiced it until the words felt smooth in her mouth. She knew what she wanted to say about the 4 addresses Harrison would weaponize against her, about the teaching jobs she'd applied for and the suspicious timing of their rejections, about the way Marcus had slowly isolated her from the systems meant to protect her. But preparation felt like sand she was trying to hold in her fists. No matter how tight her grip, she felt it slipping away. At 7 o'clock, Zoe emerged from behind the screen, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She was small for 8, with her father's light brown hair and her mother's deep brown eyes, a visible manifestation of the 2 worlds she'd been born into and never quite fit. She wore the dress Jasmine had laid out the night before without complaint, without joy, with the resigned obedience of a child who'd learned that adult decisions were made around her. Not with her. They ate breakfast in near silence. Toast and fruit, carefully portioned. Jasmine had learned to stretch groceries the way she'd learned to stretch everything else: time, money, hope. Zoe picked at her food, and Jasmine didn't have the heart to insist. Her own stomach was a clenched fist, rejecting the idea of food entirely. The bus ride downtown was surreal. Ordinary people commuting to ordinary jobs, while Jasmine felt like she was traveling to her own trial. She held Zoe's hand too tightly, and Zoe didn't complain. They were both good at not complaining, at swallowing discomfort until it became just another thing they carried. The courthouse rose before them like a monument to systems Jasmine had been taught to trust. White stone columns, broad steps, the American flag snapping in the morning breeze. Justice was supposed to happen here. Fairness, protection for people who couldn't protect themselves. She'd believed that once, believed in the inherent goodness of institutions designed to help. That belief had cost her everything the first time. She was trying desperately not to let it cost her Zoe. They climbed the steps slowly. At the top, near the entrance, a black BMW pulled to the curb. Jasmine's stomach dropped. She knew that car, had ridden in it countless times when it had belonged to both of them, when ours had still been a word they could use. Marcus emerged first, looking like he'd stepped from a magazine spread about successful men. His suit was charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, the kind that cost more than Jasmine's rent. His hair was touched with distinguished silver at the temples. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd never doubted the world would bend to accommodate him. David Harrison followed, his leather briefcase gleaming, his expression already arranged into the professional sympathy he'd wear like a mask throughout the hearing. He was older than Marcus, mid-50s, with the kind of practiced charm that felt like a weapon wrapped in a smile. They saw Jasmine and Zoe immediately. There was no avoiding the encounter, no way to slip past unnoticed. Marcus's face shifted into something approximating warmth as he approached his daughter. "Hey there, princess." His voice was gentle, designed for an 8-year-old's ears. "Big day today, but don't worry, everything's going to be fine. Daddy's going to make sure we can be together more. Won't that be nice?" Zoe looked up at her mother, uncertainty flickering across her small face. Jasmine felt the words like barbs. The casual presumption that this was about what Marcus wanted, that his winning would be Zoe's relief, that Jasmine was somehow the obstacle to their daughter's happiness rather than its foundation. Harrison turned his attention to Jasmine, his smile sharper now, professional courtesy with an edge. "Mrs. Parker, I understand you'll be representing yourself today." The question was inflected with something between pity and condescension, as if self-representation were evidence of poor judgment rather than economic necessity. Jasmine forced her spine straight, forced her voice to remain level. "Yes, I'm prepared." "I'm sure you are." The words were kind. The tone suggested otherwise. "These proceedings can be complex. Procedure matters in family court, but I'm sure the judge will make allowances." Allowances. As if she were a child playing at adult business. Jasmine felt heat rise in her chest but swallowed it down. Getting angry now, before they'd even entered the courtroom, would only confirm whatever narrative Harrison had already constructed about her emotional instability. They moved through the courthouse corridors in an awkward cluster. Marcus and Harrison walked slightly ahead, conferring in low voices. Jasmine and Zoe followed at a distance, separated by more than just physical space. The hallways smelled of floor polish and old wood and the peculiar anxiety that courthouses seemed to absorb from the thousands of desperate people who passed through them seeking judgment. At the courtroom door, Jasmine paused. Through the small window, she could see the room already arranged for proceedings. The judge's bench elevated and imposing, the tables for opposing parties, the gallery benches where no one would sit because this was family court, where battles were meant to be private even as they determined the fundamental structure of lives. And behind the bench, reviewing papers, was Judge Diane Williams, a black woman perhaps in her early 50s, wearing the black robes that transformed individuals into representatives of institutional authority. Jasmine felt something unfurl in her chest, not quite hope, but a cousin to it. Recognition. The possibility that someone in this room might understand what it meant to navigate systems designed to diminish you. She pushed through the door, Zoe's hand still clasped in hers. The courtroom was smaller than she'd imagined, more intimate. There was nowhere to hide here, no way to make herself invisible. She would be seen, would be judged, would either be heard or dismissed based on factors she couldn't entirely control. They took their seats at the respondents' table. Marcus and Harrison claimed the petitioner's side with the ease of people who'd done this before, who understood courthouse geography instinctively. Jasmine spread her papers before her with careful precision, trying to project competence despite the way her hands wanted to shake. The manila envelope sat at the top of her stack, waiting. A court clerk entered, a young Asian woman with kind eyes who glanced at Jasmine with what might have been sympathy. She called the room to order, announced the case number and parties involved. Jasmine Parker versus Marcus Parker, custody modification hearing, as if their entire family could be reduced to a case number and a procedural category. Judge Williams entered and everyone rose. She carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades earning respect in rooms that didn't want to give it. She settled behind the bench, adjusted her glasses, reviewed the file before her with an expression that revealed nothing. When she looked up, her gaze swept the room with professional neutrality. Her eyes touched on Marcus and Harrison, then moved to Jasmine and lingered for just a moment. Jasmine searched that look for recognition, for some signal that this black woman in robes saw her, understood her, would protect her. But Judge Williams's face remained carefully blank, a mask of judicial impartiality. The judge's voice was measured, clear, designed to carry authority without aggression. This is a custody modification hearing in the matter of Parker versus Parker, regarding the minor child Zoe Marie Parker. Mr. Parker, as the petitioner seeking modification, you'll present your case first. Harrison rose, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced ease. He moved to the lectern with the confidence of a man who'd performed this routine hundreds of times. Jasmine watched him arrange his notes, clear his throat, prepare to dismantle her life with words carefully chosen to sound like concern. Your Honor, thank you. This is a difficult matter for my client, who loves his daughter deeply, but has growing concerns about the child's welfare in her current primary placement. Over the past 2 years, we've documented significant instability in Mrs. Parker's living situation. She's resided at 4 different addresses, creating an unstable environment for the child. She's currently living in a studio apartment where the child doesn't even have her own bedroom. Jasmine felt the words like physical blows, each one technically true, but stripped of context, weaponized against her. She wanted to speak, to explain that the addresses changed because landlords kept raising rent she couldn't afford, that the studio apartment was all she could manage on substitute teaching pay, that Zoe had a corner behind a screen that they'd worked together to make feel special and private. But she'd been told to wait her turn. She'd been told procedure mattered. So she sat, jaw clenched, and let Harrison continue. Furthermore, Mrs. Parker is currently unemployed. She possesses a teaching credential, but hasn't maintained steady employment in over 18 months. This creates financial instability that directly impacts the child's welfare. Meanwhile, my client can provide a stable home environment, consistent income, and the resources necessary for proper child rearing. The urge to interrupt became almost unbearable. Jasmine's hand twitched toward the papers before her, toward the evidence of job applications and interviews, and the suspicious pattern of opportunities that vanished after initial interest. But she held herself still, waiting for the moment she'd be allowed to speak. Harrison pressed on, building his case brick by brick. Missed school events. Because Marcus had them scheduled during work hours, he knew Jasmine couldn't take off. Concerns about emotional stability, based on a single crying episode when Jasmine had dropped Zoe off at his house the week after losing yet another job. Every fact marshaled into service of a narrative that painted Jasmine as struggling, unstable, unable to provide the proper environment for a child. Judge Williams listened without expression. taking notes occasionally, her face revealing nothing. Jasmine kept glancing at her, searching for some sign of reaction, some indication that the judge could see through Harrison's carefully constructed narrative to the truth beneath. But the judge simply listened, allowing Harrison to speak uninterrupted, her silence feeling like complicity to Jasmine's increasingly desperate heart. Finally, unable to contain herself any longer, Jasmine found her voice. "That's not," she started, the words escaping before she could stop them. Harrison turned to her, eyebrows raised in theatrical surprise. "I'm sorry, is there an objection?" Judge Williams's gaze shifted to Jasmine. "Mrs. Parker, you'll have the opportunity to respond when Mr. Harrison completes his presentation. Please wait until you're recognized." The words were delivered without heat, without obvious bias, just a neutral reminder of procedure. But Jasmine felt them like a rejection. She'd hoped for protection, for intervention, for the judge to see that this performance was designed to silence her. Instead, she got procedure. She sank back into her chair, the fight draining out of her momentarily. Zoe sat in the gallery behind her, close enough that Jasmine could hear her daughter's quiet breathing, could feel the weight of the child's attention. What lesson was Zoe learning in this moment? That her mother was too weak to fight back? That powerful men with expensive lawyers always won? That systems meant to protect actually just enforced existing hierarchies of power? Harrison continued, warming to his theme now. "Your Honor, we're not suggesting that Mrs. Parker doesn't love her child. I'm sure she does. But love isn't sufficient when it comes to custody determinations. The court must consider stability, resources, and the child's best interests. My client can provide private schooling, healthcare, extracurricular opportunities. He has a stable home in an excellent school district. He works from home, allowing him to be present for the child in ways Mrs. Parker's unpredictable schedule doesn't permit." Each point landed like a hammer blow. Jasmine's carefully organized evidence felt suddenly inadequate, amateur, the work of someone playing at law, while professionals dismantled her. She looked at Judge Williams again, silently pleading for the woman to see what was happening here, to recognize the systemic disadvantages being weaponized against her. But Judge Williams simply nodded for Harrison to continue, her expression unchanged, her silence absolute. Harrison's voice filled the courtroom with the practiced cadence of someone who delivered similar presentations countless times before. Each word was chosen for maximum impact, each pause calculated to let his point sink into the judge's consciousness. Jasmine sat rigid in her chair, feeling the weight of his narrative settling over her like a shroud, transforming her from a devoted mother into a cautionary tale about instability and poor judgment. "Your Honor, I'd like to address the pattern we've observed regarding Mrs. Parker's employment situation." Harrison pulled a document from his file with theatrical precision. "Mrs. Parker holds a valid teaching credential from the state of California. She was employed as a second-grade teacher at Riverside Elementary for 3 years following her divorce. However, her employment was terminated in March of last year. Since then, she's held only sporadic substitute teaching positions, none lasting more than a few weeks." Jasmine's jaw clenched. The way he told it, her job loss sounded like personal failure rather than budget cuts that had eliminated her position along with 2 others. The way he told it, her substitute work sounded like inability to maintain employment rather than the reality of a flooded market where full-time positions were scarce and heavily competed for. But she held her tongue, remembering the judge's instruction to wait her turn. Harrison continued, warming to his theme. "This employment instability has direct consequences for the child. Mrs. Parker has been unable to maintain consistent health insurance for herself or Zoe. The child has missed routine, dental appointments, because Mrs. Parker couldn't afford the co-pays. Meanwhile, Mr. Parker has maintained excellent health care coverage that includes dental, vision, and mental health services." The mention of mental health services felt like a barb, a subtle suggestion that Jasmine was not just financially unstable, but emotionally suspect. She wanted to stand, to scream that she'd taken Zoe to every free clinic she could find, that she'd skipped meals to make sure her daughter ate, that she'd sat up nights researching sliding-scale healthcare options, because loving your child meant finding ways to care for them, even when the system made it nearly impossible. But she didn't stand. She didn't scream. She sat and took it because that's what she'd been taught to do. Wait your turn. Follow procedure. Trust that the system would eventually hear you if you just remained patient and compliant long enough. Judge Williams wrote something in her notes, her expression unchanging. Jasmine stared at her, willing the judge to look up, to make eye contact, to give some sign that she understood what was really happening here. But the judge's attention remained fixed on her notepad, her pen moving in steady, measured strokes. Harrison produced another document. I'd also like to address the issue of school involvement. Zoe's school maintains detailed records of parental engagement. In the past academic year, Mr. Parker has attended every parent-teacher conference, every school performance, every open house. Mrs. Parker's attendance has been sporadic at best. She missed the fall parent-teacher conference entirely. She was absent from Zoe's winter concert. Because he schedules them during my work hours. The words burst from Jasmine before she could stop them, propelled by a frustration that had been building for months. He knows when I'm working and he... Harrison turned to her with an expression of practiced patience, as if she were a child interrupting adult conversation. Your Honor, I must object to these outbursts. Mrs. Parker will have her opportunity to present her defense. Judge Williams's gaze shifted to Jasmine, and for a moment their eyes met. Jasmine searched that look desperately for some sign of understanding, some acknowledgement of the trap she was caught in. But the judge's face remained professionally neutral, revealing nothing. Mrs. Parker, Judge Williams said, her voice level and firm, you will have the opportunity to respond to these allegations when Mr. Harrison completes his presentation. Until then, please refrain from interrupting. This is a courtroom, and we will maintain proper decorum. The reprimand was delivered without anger, almost gently, but it landed like a slap nonetheless. Jasmine felt heat flood her face, felt the sting of tears she absolutely could not allow to fall. Behind her, she heard Zoe shift in her seat, could imagine her daughter's small face crumpling with the understanding that her mother was being scolded, diminished, put in her place. This was the moment Jasmine had feared, the moment her ghost had warned her about. Speak up and be labeled as disruptive, angry, unable to control yourself. Stay silent and let lies become the official record. There was no winning move, no right answer, just the slow suffocation of being systematically silenced while someone else narrated your life. Harrison pressed his advantage, moving through his points with renewed confidence. He presented Marcus's work-from-home arrangement as evidence of flexibility and availability, contrasting it with Jasmine's unpredictable schedule. He highlighted the school district boundaries, noting that Marcus's address fell within the boundaries of one of the county's highest-rated elementary schools, while Jasmine's studio apartment was zoned for a school with lower test scores and fewer resources. Every fact was technically accurate. Every conclusion was devastatingly unfair. Harrison was building a case not about parenting, but about economics, about the advantages that money bought and the disadvantages that poverty imposed. And he was doing it in a way that made it sound like personal failing rather than systemic inequality. Jasmine glanced at the manila envelope sitting on top of her stack of papers. Inside was evidence that could counter many of Harrison's points. Documentation of the job applications that had mysteriously fallen through after initial interest. Email chains showing Marcus's pattern of scheduling school events during times he knew conflicted with her work. Medical records showing that she'd taken Zoe to every available free clinic when insurance lapsed. But the envelope sat unopened, waiting for her turn to speak, a turn that felt increasingly like it might never come. Judge Williams continued to take notes, occasionally asking Harrison to clarify a point or provide additional documentation. Her questions were precise, legal, focused on establishing facts for the record, but they weren't the questions Jasmine desperately needed asked. They weren't. Mr. Harrison, has your client considered how his scheduling decisions affect Mrs. Parker's ability to attend school events? They weren't. Can you explain the employment market for teachers in this district and how budget cuts have affected job availability? They weren't. Have you considered how systemic economic inequality might be impacting this family's circumstances? Instead, the questions were about dates and documentation, about procedure and protocol, about establishing a record that would look orderly and professional on paper, while completely missing the human reality beneath it. A memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. Jasmine was 12 years old, sitting in the principal's office with her mother. A teacher had given her a failing grade on a project that Jasmine knew she'd completed perfectly. Her mother had come to the school, had raised her voice, had demanded justice for her daughter. And the principal had listened with the same carefully neutral expression Judge Williams wore now, had nodded and taken notes, and then done nothing except document that Jasmine's mother was aggressive and difficult to work with. The grade had stood. Jasmine had been transferred to a different class, and her mother had learned too late that fighting the system often just gave the system more ammunition to use against you. Jasmine had sworn she wouldn't make the same mistake. She would be calm, reasonable, compliant. She would trust that patience would be rewarded, that the system would recognize her good faith and respond in kind. But sitting here now, watching Harrison systematically destroy her character while the judge sat silent, she felt the foundations of that belief crumbling. Harrison moved to his final points, the ones clearly designed for maximum impact. Your Honor, I want to be clear that we're not suggesting Mrs. Parker is a bad person or that she doesn't love her daughter. But love alone doesn't meet the legal standard for custody determinations. The court must consider the child's best interests, which include stability, resources, and environment. Mr. Parker can provide all of these things. Mrs. Parker, despite her best efforts, currently cannot. The phrase "despite her best efforts" was particularly galling, suggesting that trying hard but failing was somehow worse than not having to try at all. Jasmine's hands clenched into fists beneath the table, her nails digging into her palms hard enough to hurt. We're requesting a modification of the current custody arrangement to grant Mr. Parker primary physical custody, with Mrs. Parker having reasonable visitation. We believe this serves the child's best interests and provides the stability she needs during these formative years. Thank you, Your Honor. Harrison returned to his seat with the satisfied air of someone who'd delivered an effective performance. Marcus leaned over to murmur something to him, and Harrison nodded, both men exuding confidence. They looked like a team, coordinated and powerful, while Jasmine sat alone at her table, her borrowed dress and amateur case file suddenly feeling like props in a play where she didn't know her lines. Judge Williams looked up from her notes. Mrs. Parker, you may present your response. This was it. The moment she'd prepared for, practiced for, lost sleep over, Jasmine stood on legs that felt unsteady, gathering her papers with hands that wanted to shake. She moved to the lectern, aware of everyone's eyes on her, aware of how different she must look from Harrison with his expensive suit and practiced ease. She placed her carefully prepared statement on the lectern, looked down at the words she'd rehearsed so many times, and opened her mouth to speak. Your Honor, I'd like to address the allegations that Mrs. Parker, Judge Williams interrupted, her tone neutral but firm. Before you begin, I need to remind you that this is a legal proceeding with specific evidentiary standards. Any claims you make should be supported by documentation. Do you have organized evidence to present? The question wasn't unkind, but it felt like another obstacle, another reminder that she was operating without the professional guidance that Marcus had purchased. Yes, Your Honor, I have documentation addressing each of Mr. Harrison's points. Then please proceed, but stay focused on facts and evidence rather than emotional appeals. The instruction stung, even though it was probably standard. Don't be emotional. Don't be angry. Don't be the stereotype they expect you to be. Just present facts as if facts alone could compete with the narrative that money and professional presentation had built. Jasmine took a breath and began. Your Honor, Mr. Harrison suggested that I've been residentially unstable, moving 4 times in 2 years. What he didn't mention is that 3 of those moves were forced by landlords, raising rent beyond what I could afford on substitute teaching income. I didn't choose instability. I was priced out of stability. She pulled out her documentation, rent increase notices, and moving receipts, and approached the bench to submit them. Judge Williams accepted them without comment, adding them to the growing pile of paperwork that would supposedly determine Zoe's future. Regarding my employment situation, Mrs. Parker, Harrison interrupted from his seat. Is there a question pending? Because if she's just making statements, I'm not sure what the proper procedure. Mr. Harrison, Judge Williams said, and there was something in her tone that made him stop mid-sentence. Mrs. Parker is responding to allegations you raised. She's entitled to present her defense. Please don't interrupt. It was the first time the judge had shut Harrison down, and Jasmine felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. But Judge Williams's expression remained unchanged, giving no sign that the intervention meant anything beyond maintaining procedural fairness. Jasmine continued, trying to find her rhythm again. I was laid off from Riverside Elementary due to budget cuts, not performance issues. I have a letter from the principal confirming this. Since then, I've applied to 47 teaching positions in this county. I've had 12 interviews. Several resulted in job offers that were then rescinded. I have email documentation showing that in at least 3 cases, the school districts received calls from someone claiming to have concerns about my fitness as an employee. She pulled out the printed emails, the paper trails she'd painstakingly assembled. I believe Mr. Parker or his representatives contacted these districts to sabotage my employment opportunities. I can't prove it definitively, but the pattern is suspicious. Job offers rescinded within days of being extended, always after the district conducted additional background checks that I never authorized. Harrison made a dismissive sound. Your Honor, this is pure speculation. Mrs. Parker is suggesting some kind of conspiracy theory rather than accepting that perhaps her interviews didn't go as well as she believed. Judge Williams held up a hand. Mr. Harrison, you'll have an opportunity to rebut. Mrs. Parker, do you have any concrete evidence linking Mr. Parker to these withdrawn job offers? No, Your Honor. Just the pattern and timing. Then we'll note your suspicions for the record, but they can't be considered as established fact. Please continue with matters you can document. The dismissal was gentle but absolute. Jasmine felt another piece of her case crumbling, another avenue of truth closed off because she couldn't meet the evidentiary burden that money could buy. Private investigators, phone records, the kind of proof that required resources she didn't have. She pressed on, addressing the healthcare issues, explaining about the free clinics and sliding scale payment plans she'd arranged, showing receipts proving that Zoe had received care even when insurance lapsed. She addressed the school involvement, presenting the email chains showing her repeated attempts to attend events and Marcus's pattern of scheduling them during her confirmed work hours. With each point, she submitted documentation, building her case piece by piece, but it felt like trying to hold back a flood with sandbags. Harrison had painted a picture of inadequacy that was so much simpler, so much easier to understand than the complex reality of trying to parent while poor in a system designed to penalize poverty. And through it all, Judge Williams listened with that same neutral expression, taking notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but giving no indication of which way she was leaning. Jasmine kept searching the judge's face for some sign of understanding, some recognition of their shared experience as Black women navigating systems that weren't built for them. But the judge's professional mask never slipped. After 40 minutes of presentation, Jasmine reached the end of her prepared remarks. She'd addressed every major point Harrison had raised, submitted documentation for everything she could prove, and explained as clearly as possible why the appearance of instability was actually the result of systemic barriers rather than personal failing. But she could feel the inadequacy of it, could sense that facts and documents weren't enough when they were being compared against Harrison's polished narrative and Marcus's obvious advantages. She was losing. She could feel herself losing despite everything she'd prepared, everything she'd tried to do right. Your Honor, she said, her voice carrying the weight of desperation she'd tried so hard to keep hidden. "I love my daughter. I've done everything I can to provide for her with the limited resources I have. Mr. Parker has money and lawyers and the ability to create the appearance of stability. But I'm the one who's been there every day. I'm the one who knows her nightmares and her favorite songs and the way she likes her sandwiches cut. I'm her mother. Please don't take her away from me because I can't afford to pretend poverty isn't real." The words hung in the air, more emotional than she'd intended, more raw than was probably wise. She'd broken her own rule, let feeling creep into what was supposed to be a factual presentation. Harrison would use it against her, would paint her as unstable and emotional, but the words had needed to be said, even if they cost her. Judge Williams looked at her for a long moment, and Jasmine could have sworn she saw something flicker in the judge's eyes, recognition, maybe, or understanding, or some emotion, quickly suppressed beneath the professional mask. But it was gone so fast that Jasmine might have imagined it. "Thank you, Mrs. Parker. Mr. Harrison, do you have rebuttal testimony?" Harrison stood, clearly relishing the opportunity. "Briefly, Your Honor, Mrs. Parker has presented what I'm sure she believes is adequate documentation, but the core issues remain unchanged. She is economically unstable through no fault of her own. I stipulate that. But we're not here to assign blame for economic circumstances. We're here to determine what's best for the child. And the simple fact is that Mr. Parker can provide resources and stability that Mrs. Parker cannot. That's not a judgment on her character. It's just reality." The reasonableness of his tone made it worse, made it sound like he was being compassionate rather than arguing for the legal codification of economic inequality. Jasmine wanted to scream that reducing a child's best interest to a balance sheet was itself a judgment, was itself a system that valued money over love, appearance over substance. But she remained silent because what else could she do? She'd presented her case. She'd submitted her evidence. The rest was out of her hands, dependent on a judge who'd shown no sign of which way she would rule, who'd maintained perfect professional neutrality, even as Jasmine was systematically dismantled by a better-funded opponent. Judge Williams called for a brief recess to review the submitted materials. Jasmine returned to her seat, feeling hollowed out and exhausted. Behind her, she heard Zoe's quiet voice, asking when they could go home. Home. The studio apartment that Harrison had painted as evidence of inadequacy. The space that Jasmine had tried so hard to make feel safe and comfortable for her daughter despite its limitations. During the recess, Jasmine couldn't sit still. She paced the hallway outside the courtroom, the manila envelope still clutched in her hand, unopened. Inside were the additional documents, the evidence she hadn't been able to present because Harrison's narrative had consumed all the oxygen in the room. Bank records showing Marcus's substantial withdrawals from accounts that should have been split in the divorce. Email, evidence of coordination between Marcus and potential employers. Documentation of Zoe's anxiety symptoms that appeared specifically on weeks she stayed with her father. But she hadn't found the right moment to present them. Hadn't been able to break through Harrison's carefully constructed case, to introduce evidence that complicated the simple story he'd told. And now, with the recess ending and the judge preparing to rule, Jasmine wasn't sure she'd get another chance. They filed back into the courtroom. Judge Williams had returned to the bench, her expression still unreadable, still maintaining that professional distance that made it impossible to guess which way the decision would fall. Jasmine's heart hammered in her chest. Everything came down to this moment, to whatever words this woman was about to speak. But before Judge Williams could begin, Marcus leaned over and whispered something to Harrison. The lawyer nodded, then stood. "Your Honor, before you rule, my client would like to make a brief statement if the court permits." Judge Williams considered this, then nodded. "Mr. Parker, you may speak. Please keep it brief." Marcus rose and Jasmine felt ice water flood her veins. This wasn't part of the plan, wasn't something she'd anticipated. Marcus approached the front of the courtroom, and for the first time that day, his carefully constructed veneer seemed to crack slightly, showing something more genuine beneath. "Your Honor, I want to be clear about something. This isn't about punishing Jasmine or suggesting she's a bad mother. She's not. She loves Zoe, and I've never doubted that. His voice carried a warmth that felt almost sincere, almost like the man Jasmine had once loved before everything fell apart. But love isn't enough when a child doesn't have basic stability. I can provide that stability. I have the resources to ensure Zoe has everything she needs: education, health care, opportunities. Jasmine is doing her best, but her best isn't enough right now, and Zoe deserves more than just love. She deserves security. The words were crafted to sound reasonable, compassionate even, as if taking Zoe away from her mother was an act of kindness rather than cruelty. Jasmine felt something inside her snap, some last reserve of patience and compliance breaking under the weight of this final performance. She stood, the manila envelope falling to the table with a slap that echoed in the courtroom. "That's not," she started, her voice louder than she'd intended, carrying the full weight of months of suppressed frustration and fear. "This isn't about Zoe's welfare. This is about control. This is about you punishing me for leaving you." Harrison was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate. Mrs. Parker is disrupting the proceedings." Judge Williams raised a hand, silencing Harrison, but her gaze was fixed on Jasmine. For the first time all day, the judge's mask of neutrality seemed to shift, revealing something beneath, not sympathy exactly, but a sharp attention that hadn't been there before. "Mrs. Parker," the judge said, her voice carrying a strange quality that Jasmine couldn't quite identify. "Do you have something else you wish to present to this court?" It was phrased as a question, but it felt like something more, an invitation maybe, or a challenge. Jasmine looked at Judge Williams, at the first genuine eye contact they'd had all day, and saw something there that made her heart race. The judge wasn't dismissing her outburst. She was waiting, expecting something. Jasmine's hand moved to the manila envelope. The documents inside represented her last chance, the evidence she'd been too intimidated, too trained in compliance, too afraid of being labeled disruptive to present. But Judge Williams was looking at her with eyes that said, "I'm listening now. What do you have to say?" "Yes, Your Honor," Jasmine said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I have something to present." She picked up the envelope with hands that still trembled, but no longer felt quite so helpless. This was it, the moment she stopped waiting for permission and started demanding to be heard. Whatever happened next, she would face it knowing she hadn't remained silent, hadn't let someone else write the final chapter of her story. Judge Williams nodded slowly, then did something unexpected. She reached across the bench and pushed her microphone slightly toward the center, toward where Jasmine stood. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, but it felt monumental, an invitation to speak, an opening in the wall of professional neutrality that had seemed impenetrable just moments before. "Please," Judge Williams said, and there was something in her voice that Jasmine recognized now, something that sounded like another black woman saying, "I've been waiting all day for you to find your voice. Now use it. The court would like to hear what you have to say." Jasmine's hands no longer trembled as she opened the manila envelope. The fear that had gripped her all morning, the anxiety that had made her question every word before speaking it, had burned away in the heat of that final moment of defiance. She'd spent so long being careful, being compliant, waiting for permission to exist in spaces that weren't designed for her. That patience had gotten her nowhere. Now, standing before Judge Williams with the microphone pushed toward her like an offering, she understood that silence had never been safety. It had only been slow suffocation. She pulled the first document from the envelope and approached the bench. "Your Honor, Mr. Harrison suggested that my job losses were due to poor performance or bad interviews. I'd like to submit phone records showing that Marcus's personal cell phone made calls to 3 different school districts within 24 hours of each district, extending me employment offers. All 3 offers were rescinded within a week." Judge Williams accepted the phone records, examining them with newfound attention. Harrison stood, preparing to object, but the judge raised a hand without looking at him. "I'll hear the evidence before entertaining objections, Mr. Harrison. Continue, Mrs. Parker. The shift in the room was palpable. Something had changed in Judge Williams's demeanor, a transformation from neutral arbiter to engaged listener. Jasmine felt it like oxygen returning to airless lungs. These aren't suspicions anymore, Your Honor. These are documented patterns. She pulled out the next set of papers. Here are email exchanges between Marcus and the Sunset Academy principal. Marcus sent unsolicited references claiming I had emotional stability issues and was unreliable with commitments. The principal forwarded these to me by mistake when she meant to send them to HR. That's why my job offer was rescinded, Harrison found his voice. Your Honor, even if we accept that these communications occurred, they represent a father's legitimate concern. They represent systematic sabotage of a mother's ability to provide for her child. Jasmine cut him off, her voice strong and clear. Which brings me to the financial records. She spread the bank statements across the bench like cards in a winning hand. During our divorce, we agreed to split our joint savings, approximately $40,000. I received $20,000, but these statements show that Marcus withdrew $18,000 from my half before the account was closed. He moved it to an offshore account registered under his mother's name. Judge Williams leaned forward, studying the documents with sharp attention. Mr. Harrison, do you have an explanation for these transactions? Harrison's confidence had fractured, but he tried to recover. Your Honor, without proper context and authentication, are properly notarized bank statements with official seals, Jasmine interrupted. I can provide contact information for the bank manager who helped me compile them. These aren't forgeries, Mr. Harrison. They're evidence of theft. The word hung in the air, stark and unambiguous. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his composed facade cracking. Judge Williams's gaze moved from the documents to Marcus, and for the first time all day, the judge's expression showed something beyond professional neutrality. Jasmine pressed forward. Your Honor, Mr. Harrison painted a picture of me as an unstable, unemployed mother living in inadequate housing. What he didn't tell you is that I'm unemployed because my ex-husband sabotaged my job prospects. I'm living in a studio apartment because he stole half my divorce settlement. The instability he's documented is instability he created. She pulled out another document, her hands steady now. These are therapy records for Zoe. Her counselor has been treating her for anxiety that manifests specifically during weeks she stays with her father. The therapist has documented Zoe's statements about feeling watched all the time at Marcus's house, about his fiancée making comments about her hair being too wild and needing to be straightened. The therapy records hit differently than the financial documents. These weren't about money or logistics. These were about a child's emotional welfare, the very thing Marcus had claimed to prioritize. Judge Williams read through them slowly, her expression darkening with each page. Your Honor, Jasmine continued, Marcus said that love isn't enough. He said Zoe needs stability and resources and security. But what she actually needs is to feel safe. She needs to be able to wear her hair natural without being told it's inappropriate. She needs a parent who sees her as a whole person, not a project to be perfected. Judge Williams set down the therapy records and looked directly at Jasmine for a long moment. Then she turned her attention to Marcus and Harrison. Mr. Parker, I have some questions for you. Did you contact Mrs. Parker's potential employers to provide unsolicited references? Marcus glanced at Harrison, clearly uncertain. Harrison started to stand, but Judge Williams's sharp look stopped him. Mr. Parker, I asked you a question. The silence stretched. Finally, Marcus nodded. I may have made some calls. I was concerned about Zoe's welfare. Did you withdraw $18,000 from an account that was supposed to be split equally with Mrs. Parker? Another pause. Another reluctant admission. There were legitimate expenses that needed to be covered. Without Mrs. Parker's knowledge or consent? Marcus had no good answer for that. His silence was admission enough. Judge Williams sat back, and when she spoke again, her voice carried 25 years of witnessing these same patterns. I'm going to say something now that I don't often say from this bench. Mrs. Parker, I owe you an apology. The words shocked everyone in the courtroom. Jasmine felt her breath catch. I've spent this entire hearing watching you be interrupted, talked over, and systematically dismissed. I did not intervene when Mr. Harrison cut you off. I maintained what I believed was appropriate judicial neutrality while watching a mother be silenced in my courtroom. She paused, and Jasmine saw something in the judge's eyes that looked like shared understanding. I did this deliberately because I've presided over hundreds of these cases. And I've learned something that troubles me deeply. When I intervene too quickly to protect women like you, the opposing counsel argues that I'm biased. They appeal my decisions, and sometimes those appeals succeed. Jasmine felt tears threatening but refused to let them fall. But I've also learned this, the judge continued. Sometimes the most powerful thing I can do is give a woman uninterrupted space to find her own voice. Because when you speak for yourself, when you present your own evidence, no one can dismiss it as judicial favoritism. Your words carry weight that my interventions never could. She turned her attention to the courtroom as a whole. Mr. Harrison, you stood here and painted a picture of an unstable mother. But what I see in these documents is evidence of a man who systematically undermined his ex-wife's ability to achieve the stability he now claims she lacks. That's not concern. That's sabotage. Harrison tried once more. Your Honor, even accepting Mrs. Parker's version of events, that he stole from his daughter's mother. Judge Williams's words were sharp. Mr. Harrison, I'm not interested in rewarding financial abuse with custody modification. She picked up the therapy records again. More troubling than the financial manipulation is this evidence of emotional harm to the child. Zoe is 8 years old and already experiencing anxiety about meeting impossible standards in her father's home. Judge Williams looked at Zoe, who sat in the gallery behind Jasmine. Young lady, I know this has been difficult to hear, but I want you to know something. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to earn love by meeting standards or having the right hair or being anything other than exactly who you are. Zoe nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. Now then, the judge continued, I'm ready to rule. Mr. Parker's petition for custody modification is denied. Mrs. Parker will retain primary physical custody of the minor child. However, I'm ordering several modifications to the existing arrangement. Relief flooded through Jasmine so powerfully that she had to grip the edge of the table to stay standing. First, Mr. Parker will immediately return the $18,000 he withdrew from the joint account with interest. Second, I'm ordering a forensic accounting of all financial transactions related to the divorce settlement. Third, I'm issuing a restraining order preventing any contact between Mr. Parker and Mrs. Parker's current or prospective employers. Any violation will result in contempt charges. Fourth, Zoe's therapy will continue, and Mr. Parker will be required to attend co-parenting counseling focused on understanding racial and cultural identity development in biracial children. Each pronouncement landed like a hammer blow, restructuring the power dynamic that had seemed so immutable just an hour ago. Finally, the judge said, I want to address something broader. Mrs. Parker, you came into this courtroom believing that the system would protect you if you just followed the rules and waited your turn. That belief cost you dearly. Judge Williams's gaze was intense. I need you to understand something. The system doesn't reward patience. It rewards power, and power comes from using your voice, from refusing to be silenced. You found that voice today. Don't ever lose it again. The words settled over Jasmine like a blessing and a challenge. This hearing is concluded, Judge William said, bringing her gavel down with finality. Mrs. Parker, you and Zoe are free to go home. Home. Jasmine turned to Zoe, who was already scrambling over the gallery railing, and caught her daughter in an embrace that felt like coming up for air after being underwater too long. Behind them, Marcus and Harrison gathered their papers in tight-lipped silence. Marcus wouldn't meet Jasmine's eyes as he left the courtroom. His carefully constructed case crumbled into evidence of his own wrongdoing. Rachel Chen, the court clerk, approached with a small smile. The judge asked me to give you this. She handed Jasmine a business card for a legal aid organization. They specialize in helping women recover from financial abuse. Jasmine took the card, adding it to the envelope that had changed everything. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun felt warmer than it had any right to feel in November. Jasmine and Zoe stood on the steps, and for the first time in months, Jasmine wasn't thinking about the next battle. She was just standing in the sunshine with her daughter, breathing freely. "Mama," Zoe said quietly, "are we really going to be okay?" Jasmine looked down at her daughter and chose honesty over false comfort. "I don't know, baby. We're still going to struggle sometimes. Money is still going to be tight, but we're going to struggle together, in our home. And nobody can take that away from us." Zoe nodded, then smiled, small but real, and Jasmine felt something in her chest expand with possibility. 3 months later, Jasmine stood in front of a classroom again. The school was different from Riverside Elementary, smaller with older facilities. But they'd hired her without requiring references from previous employers. The money from Marcus's returned theft had covered first and last month's rent on a 2-bedroom apartment. Nothing fancy, but enough space for Zoe to have her own room. The therapy continued. Zoe's anxiety was improving slowly, helped by the stability of knowing she didn't have to be perfect to earn love. She wore her hair natural now, beautiful coils that Jasmine helped her care for, and Jasmine had taken Rachel's card to the legal aid organization. They'd filed a civil suit against Marcus for the full extent of his financial sabotage. It would take years to wind through the courts, but Jasmine had learned that fighting wasn't about guaranteed outcomes. It was about refusing to accept injustice silently. Sometimes she thought about Judge Williams, about that moment when the microphone had been pushed toward her, and she'd understood that silence was no longer an option. She thought about all the other women who walked into courtrooms hoping the system would protect them. And she wondered how many of them learned, as she had, that justice required voice and courage. Jasmine still had that manila envelope, kept it in a drawer as a reminder, not of the evidence it had contained, but of the moment she'd stopped waiting for permission to defend herself, the moment she'd found her voice and refused to give it back. That was the real victory, not the court ruling or the returned money, or even keeping custody of Zoe. The victory was in understanding that she'd never needed permission to take up space, to speak loudly, to demand justice. The victory was in finally believing that her voice mattered, that her truth had power, that silence was never protection, only surrender, and she would never surrender again.